an excellent God.
Thanks.
While I'm dishing out appreciation, I would like to express my appreciation to my mentor for suggesting this morning that we do not need a message. Now, Beth and I begin every morning with the Daily Word and the Daily Guide from the Science of Mind magazine. The daily guides for August this year were written by Reverend Temple Hayes, an ordained Unity minister. In the August 7th guide, she quoted Dr. Wayne Dyer, and he said that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Did you know that? I guess you do. I've heard it before, several times. And I don't know how much you've really thought about it. Reverend Temple then wrote, I would add that the more spiritual you become in your awareness, the more connected you are to your humanity. Now it's my turn to jump onto the bandwagon. Here's my observation, and I'm sure it's not original. Spirituality and humanity are like love and marriage. And you've heard this before too. They're like a horse and carriage. You can't have one without the other. Well, you can, but you might as well get a divorce. Now, Zen Buddhism has a saying about the reflection of the moon on water. No moon, no moon. No water, no moon. You have to have both. The event is caused just as much by the water as it is by the moon. A Dominican, a Franciscan, and a Jesuit were visiting a shrine, and suddenly the lights went out. The Dominican stood up and said, let us consider the nature of light and darkness and their meaning. The Franciscan began to sing a hymn in honor of our little sister. The Jesuit went out and replaced the fuse. Now, the letter of James in the New Testament asks, what does it profit us if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Now, we all know this. We state it every Sunday. It's the fifth foundational principle of unity. Knowledge of these principles is not enough. We must put them into practice and live the truth we know. And we say that's integrity. What I'm trying to say is spirituality is not worth a hill of beans if it does not enrich our human experience. A very spiritual man was out of work and his rent was due by the end of the week. He didn't have enough money. Now, this man went to church every week and he prayed regularly. He decided to pray to God, asking to win the lottery. The first 2 nights, the man prayed to God for an hour without a break. The next 2 nights, he prayed for 2 hours without result. The last 2 nights before the rent was due, the man prayed for 4 hours non-stop. And he still didn't win the lottery. On the last night, the man went to the church and started cursing out the Lord and shouting at the top of his lungs with hateful words. He started kicking over pews and breaking things left and right. At that moment, dark clouds started to gather around the church and thunder was heard booming for miles. And a great gust of wind came through and knocked down the church doors. And then a great hollowing voice exclaimed, it would help if you bought a ticket. Now, I'm not advocating buying lottery tickets or any other kind of gambling. The problem is praying and then just waiting around for God to do something. We sometimes forget that life is a product of our co-creation. I don't know if you agree with me about the value of spirituality, but you cannot escape your human experience. You're going to have it, unless you're comatose. Now, I'm comforted by the fact that Reverend Temple agrees with me. Remember that she said the more spiritual you become in your awareness, the more connected you are to your humanity. Now, I know something about the human experience. I've been having one my whole life. I was never sure about the spiritual being part. From my teenage years until I met Beth in my late 50s, I was agnostic. People tried to tell me I was a spiritual being, but I had my doubts. The first time I attended a Unity retreat, somebody asked me where I thought I was on my spiritual journey. I didn't know I was on a spiritual journey. I didn't even know what a spiritual journey was. So do me a favor. Please don't ask me questions that reveal my ignorance. I've learned a lot since then. Now I wonder how many times God called to me and I didn't know it was God calling. That's why I'm comforted by the Old Testament story of the prophet Samuel. Now, Reverend Catherine spoke about this a few weeks ago. When Samuel was a young boy, his mother made a covenant with God that he would become a priest. Fulfilling her promise, she apprenticed Samuel to the high priest Eli. Well, one night, God woke Samuel up 4 times. If you wake me up 4 times, you'd better be God. Did Samuel get irritated? No siree, Billy Bob. Each time Samuel jumped out of bed and ran into Eli's room saying, "Here I am, for you called me." Now if you think Samuel was patient, how about Eli? I raised a teenager and I lost a few hours sleep. And I'm impressed with Eli's patience. Each time Eli answered Samuel, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." And it wasn't until the 3rd time this happened that Eli realized that something significant might be going on. Could it be that God was calling Samuel? I guess I'm not as spiritually evolved as Eli or Samuel. As I said, if you wake me up 4 times in one night, you better have a good reason. However, there is always a danger that just like Samuel, I wouldn't know it was God calling. Now, I can answer that question about my spiritual journey now, but it hasn't come easily. I spent a lot of time wondering why I wasn't spiritual enough. There were all those times I spent meditating and God wouldn't speak to me. You know what I'm saying? Now I wonder how many times God did speak to me and I didn't realize it was God speaking. And that's why I'm comforted by the story of Samuel. After all, Samuel didn't know it was God calling at first. And even Eli took a while to catch on. And they were a high priest and one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. Well, the story of Samuel goes way beyond assuaging our guilt over our spiritual inadequacies. The important thing is that this story is really about you and me. I'm suggesting that there's something of Samuel and there's something of Eli in you and in me. And this is the part that metaphysics plays in Unity teaching. We read between the lines in the Bible stories to discern how these stories apply in our own spiritual journeys. In my opinion, the Bible may be entertaining, but it's meaningless if it doesn't say anything, if it doesn't tell us anything about us. So let's look at Eli and Samuel from the metaphysical point of view. In a Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, Unity's co-founder Charles Fillmore tells us that Eli represents the intellect under spiritual discipline. And then he says that Samuel represents the inner voice through whose expression we come into a larger realization of ourselves. Our intellectual faculties are part of our human experience. The inner voice guides our spiritual identity. That we have so we have both Eli characteristics and Samuel characteristics. That we have both is critical. Remember that Samuel required the guidance of Eli before he could realize the significance of the inner voice. Without our intellectual faculties, our spirituality lacks focus. Remember our 3rd foundational principle? Everything we manifest begins with a thought. As Charles Fillmore also tells us, our first unfoldment is always through the intellect. But he also says that while Eli is typical of the phase of man's consciousness that is always seeking spiritual progress, yet true progress cannot be made by a merely intellectual understanding of truth. The Science of Mind founder, Ernest Holmes, agrees with Mr. Fillmore. He wrote, "We have the logic, we have the reason, we have the conviction. We believe these things, you and I, and perhaps most of the world does. They would if they understood them, I'm sure. But to this intellectual concept, to this mathematical understanding, something else must be added. One is the spirit, and the other is the letter of the law. There is, to the testimony of the intellect, the mind, the intelligence, the logic and reason, another and higher testimony, which cannot be explained." Now, Mr. Holmes tells of this experience he had. He said, "A man recently said to me, 'I like what you're doing, but I'm technically trained. I'm an engineer. I can't get my intellect out of the way. And yet I know I have to. Help me, won't you?' I said, 'You go home and meditate tonight, and after you finish your meditation, turn to your intellect and say, "All right, intellect, go lay an egg."' 'Oh,' he said, 'don't be facetious.' 'I'm not facetious,' I replied, 'because if your intellect can't lay an egg, how are you ever going to get a chicken?' Now there's a higher truth here, but I can't bring myself to tell my intellect to go lay an egg. Spirituality begins with a thought. Therefore, my intellect must support my spiritual identity, who I truly am, my I am. By the same token, my I am supports my intellect. No moon, no moon. No water, no moon. So I ask myself, how many times has God called me and I didn't know it? I have no idea how many times, because I miss most of the calls, and I've never been good at checking my inner voicemail. I was agnostic for most of my adult life. How could I know what God's voice sounded like? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Do I feel bad about it? When I first got into Unity, I felt bad about it. The other people in my classes seemed to get it. They seemed so spiritual. I had no idea what they were talking about half the time. Well, thanks to the story of Samuel, I don't feel so bad anymore. After all, God didn't say to Samuel, "Samuel, this is God speaking. Here's what I want you to do." And likewise, God has never said to me, "Charlie, this is God. I'm talking to you." How would I know? Now, Charles Fillmore made himself into an expert on the subject of communicating with spirit. And again, I'm comforted by the fact that it took him some time to learn. Charles took an oath that he would spend time in meditation every day, no matter what else was going on. And he kept that oath. But it was a long time before he noticed any positive results. Eventually, he got so he could sit down, close his eyes, and immediately enter the silence. And Charles explained his experience. He said, "As you sit in the silence, you no doubt get the inner voice, yet you do not hear it. You do not feel it. You simply know it." And that's how it was for me. I didn't hear a thing. If I felt it, I wasn't aware of it. I was simply guided one step at a time until it was a done deal. I had been an agnostic. And now, here I am standing behind this pulpit talking about the spiritual journey. I never said, "Here I am, Lord," but I knew. As Charles Fillmore said, when you make union with spirit, you will understand and will get the message, just as Samuel did. Now we're talking about the fourth foundational principle. You know it. Affirmative prayer and meditation heighten our connection with God-mind and bring forth wisdom, healing, and abundance. And we add that the gift of this principle is guidance. The wisdom, healing, and abundance are all about our human experience. Guess what the guidance is for? Now, I've experienced what some people refer to as the cosmic 2x4. I'll bet some of you have had the same experience. Cosmic 2x4s are the aha moments, when for no apparent reason we understand what had previously been mysterious. How many times has that happened to you and you wondered, where did that come from? As Richard and Mary Alice Jafala explain in The Quest, the Spirit of God will come to you in unexpected moments and unexpected ways. And The Quest also tells us, you are not a failure if you've not yet experienced the presence of the Spirit of God in your life. Worrying about it will not help. The Quest tells us that the harder we try to capture the experience of Spirit, the more elusive Spirit becomes. The more I ask myself why God wasn't speaking to me in the silence, the more frustrated I became. Remember today's daily word? I take my cue from the natural world and don't try to rush my growth or take shortcuts to reach my goals. Instead, I awaken to divine order, realizing it helps keep my life in balance. So just as Charles Fillmore did, practice. And practice being open to Spirit. It will come. Do you believe in divine order? I hope so. I heard you all affirm it this morning. Remember what you said? My life unfolds in divine order. Then you heard Joanna read it. Trying to rush the process or skip a step would create disruption of this progression in nature. Ernest Holmes said, every person may talk to Spirit, but the answer only comes back according to our concept of Spirit. The journey begins with the desire and the willingness to opening yourself to receiving the guidance of Spirit. Open is the key word. You must be willing to allow Spirit to work through you in whatever manner it desires. Spirit will show you the path, but you must walk that path. In the October 3rd Daily Guide, Ernest Holmes wrote, power is, and mind is, and life is. But they have to flow through us in order to express in our lives. We're dealing with law, and nature must be obeyed before it'll work for us. Just realize that this law is as natural a law as any other of God's laws, and use it with the same intelligence as you would use the law of electricity. Then you will get the desired results. The individual who has the most power is the one who has the greatest realization of the divine presence, and to whom this means the most as an active principle of his life. We all need more backbone and less wishbone. There is something which waits only for our recognition to spring into being, bringing with it all the power of the universe. 3 friends from one local congregation were asked, when you're in the casket and friends and congregation members are mourning over you, what would you like them to say? Hardy said, I'd like them to say I was a wonderful husband, a fine spiritual leader, and a great family man. Eugene said, I would like them to say that I was a wonderful teacher and servant of God who made a huge difference in people's lives. And Al said, I would like them to say, look, he's moving. Now I ask you, which one of those guys has not taken Catherine's class, Finding Yourself in Transition? Shannon Alder is an inspirational writer. She wrote, I am convinced that the jealous, the angry, the bitter, and the egotistical are the first to race to the top of the mountains. A confident person enjoys the journey, the people they meet along the way, and sees life not as a competition. They reach the summit last because they know that God isn't at the top waiting for them. He's down below helping his followers to understand that the view is glorious wherever you stand. I remind you now that everything we manifest begins with a thought. It begins with an intellectual idea born of a desire. It comes out of our human experience, but it's significant that the Latin root of the word desire translates as of God. Then Spirit will show us the path, but we must walk that path. Or in terms better understood by many of our neighbors, Sitting still and wishing made no person great. The good Lord sends the fishing, but you must dig the bait. So I agree with Charles Fillmore and Ernest Holmes, Wayne Dyer and Temple Hayes. You and I are spiritual beings having human experiences. And that's a good thing, because spirituality and humanity go together like a horse and carriage. You can't have one without the other.